We've looked at the Enlightenment critique of the Ancien Régime, of that union of throne and altar of a French Bourbon monarchy. We've seen that the Enlightenment began to challenge so many of the assumptions that French society represented and assumed to be correct and part of the tradition that had grown up over a number of centuries. But the real question was the critique accurate? What was French society really like? Were those Enlightenment critics, in fact, reflecting a kind of reality, or were they, in fact, being unkind to the nature of the society in which they lived? What was France like, in other words, in 1789, on the eve of the Revolution? Well, the reality was, French society in 1789 was archaic. It was a vestige of its feudal, absolutist past, and it was still divided legally into the three estates of clergy, nobility, and people, just as we saw in the Middle Ages. Let's look at these severally. The first estate, or the clergy, was the least numerous. The effect of rationalism and anti-clericalism and the monopoly of any high position and opportunity for advancement by the nobility made this spiritual life very unattractive to spiritually aware men and women in France. Consequently, less than 0.5% of the population represented this first estate. But this tiny number, this very, very small number of clerics, owned about 10% of the land. Moreover, this land was exempt from taxation. It was poorly managed as a rule, and often still cultivated by serfs because of the extraordinarily conservative land tenure techniques that the church refused to address. Moreover, the upper clergy, most of whom were nobles, in fact, virtually all were nobles because, as we saw previously, that a natural union of authority between the landholding nobility and the great clerics. These great clerics were lax in discipline. They were arrogant. They lived a lavish lifestyle, a very secular lifestyle often, at the Palace of Versailles. They were isolated from their sees, which they often never visited, simply collecting the income in order to pay their gambling debts and to sustain the quality of life that their rank required. The lower clergy, however, these were as poor as the parishes that they served. And they were extremely angry. They resented enormously church funds that should be used for charitable purposes, should be used for education and to support the other spiritual needs of the population, being spent in aristocratic style of life by these courtier bishops at the palace. Moreover, everybody recognized, clergy and laity alike, that the granting of these so-called free gifts to the crown really represented nothing short of protection money that ensured that the church would remain exempt from taxation. This worked when the church just made a deal with the crown and said that X number of livres, French pounds, would be transferred from the church to the crown. And this meant that the crown received something, but didn't actually tax the church itself. And those working ecclesiastical properties, the peasants who were working on those clerical estates, were amongst the most oppressed agricultural laborers in the kingdom, and in fact, almost in Western Europe. The second estate, that is the nobility, were more numerous. The second estate represented perhaps 2% of the total population. But they owned about 1/4 of the land of the kingdom, and when all of the royal estates were included, as much as 1/3 of France was owned by those who had aristocratic lineage. As we know, this vast landed wealth had originally supported those professional, heavily armed knights during the feudal period, those who, as a class, provided protection, administration, and justice, as well as local government. But a lot of things had happened in between. The establishment of the absolutist regimes, the transformation of European warfare, had turned the aristocracy into, at the very best, a hereditary officer class, but mostly into self-indulgent courtiers, who lacked much local authority or even, in fact, much collective influence. Many of them lived at Versailles. They left their rural estates to bailiffs who abused the peasantry, who collected more than they needed to so that they could keep the difference. So the nobility, like the clergy, was hardly a uniform group and hardly shared uniform respect. At the top of the nobility were the great aristocrats, those of ancient lineage, the noblesse de l'épée, the nobility of the sword, descended from those feudal families that had fought during that period of fragmentation when all of Europe was becoming more and more localized and there was desperate need for protection and government. These ancient families were arrogant, selfish, and they despised anyone not descended from families as old as theirs. If you weren't descended from Charles the Fat or Louis the Stammerer, you were in this food chain plankton. You had no rank, no role, and you were simply despised by those who believed that because of the quarterings on their coats of arms, they could treat you in a way that they thought appropriate, and it was never very well. The lesser nobility, or noblesse de la robe, was descended from the rich provincial or Parisian bourgeois families who had purchased or had been granted offices that carried patents of nobility. Now, to us, this is strange, but if you think of what we discussed when we talked about the Middle Ages, in order to have authority, in order to exercise power, this was seen as the monopoly of the noble class. So if you wanted to become, let's say, dog catcher in Paris, then that gave you a responsibility that was public. And in order to be the dog catcher, you had to be a noble. And if you weren't noble, but you purchased the position of dog catcher, you got a noble title with it. It carried a patent of nobility. Similarly, if the king decided to appoint you dog catcher, then you in fact became a noble as well. So the noblesse de la robe, the service nobility, gained its position and its titles through service to the crown and the fulfillment of public duties, which required nobility of rank. Moreover, this class was a complex group. In many instances, they engaged in marriage with the court nobility. They did so, of course, by offering their daughters with huge dowries. And they aped their manners in many instances, trying to be seen like them, to be associated with and to get some of the attendant glory to being descended from these great feudal families. But then there were others who were enlightened, who were educated, who saw the tradition coming from their service to their responsibility to the community. And these were often much more enlightened. And it was this group that translated success and power into the traditional ruling elite. These nobles, then, were not only often sympathetic to the ideas of the Enlightenment, men like the Comte de Buffon, for example, or the Baron de Montesquieu, they were often those who had some close association with the desire for change. They might not have seen change in a uniform way, but nevertheless, they provided a mechanism for some of the ideas of the enlightened bourgeoisie to percolate into the upper ranks of the nobility. At the very bottom of the nobility were the hobereaux, sparrowhawks in French. These were the poor provincial nobles. They had such small estates, they lived in decaying manor houses that they squeezed every sou that they could from their tenants. As nobles, of course, they couldn't work or trade. In France, because your rank was determined by law and by function as well as birth, if you worked, you ceased to be noble. You were dérogé. You lost your rank. So these hobereaux, proud of their descent and proud of their nobility, refused to work. And so they lived desperate lives, locked away in the countryside and despised by everyone. Despised equally by their peasants, as well as the greater, wealthier nobles who saw them simply as embarrassments. The third estate. The third estate was, of course, the people at large, 95% of the population of France. And this third estate was divided into those peasants who worked the soil, about 80% of the population, and the urban laborers, those servants, those members of the middle class, those skilled artisans in the towns, who were perhaps about 15% of the population. In the countryside, feudal serfdom was essentially extinct in France, except in certain estates of the church. And indeed, the situation was actually much better than almost anywhere else in Europe, except for England. 3/4 of the peasantry actually owned their own land. But the amount of land owned collectively by the class of the peasants was actually very small, about 30% of the arable land of France. The result was each individual peasant plot was small, not enough to guarantee a family's livelihood, but enough to give a little improvement in diet. And we also have to admit freely that many of the problems that the peasantry faced were of their own making. First of all, they were unreasonably conservative. They refused change of any kind. They refused to adopt the new agricultural techniques or to plant new crops. The agricultural revolution of the 18th century coming from England, led by men like Turnip Townsend, these indicated how, in fact, the soil could be replenished, that new crops could be grown, and that the yield could be hugely improved. Well, the French peasantry refused any of these things. They planted what their grandparents and great-grandparents had always planted. They refused to change. And so consequently, they were locked in a position that they, in fact, chose not to escape. On top of that, there was a great problem of peasant overpopulation. They bred like rabbits. The reason for this had to do in part with owning their own land and having better nutrition and consequently a higher fertility rate. But also the general population increase of the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries meant that there were more and more peasant families ever in search of wider acres. But these were minor and compared to the disadvantages of being born a peasant. Almost all of the taxation imposed by the royal government fell on the peasantry. On top of that, they had to pay tithes to the church. And not only tithes, but they had to pay a fee for every service performed by the priest. Marriage, burial, baptism, whatever it was. And then there were the manorial dues owed to the landlord. You can't generalize about these. They varied. They varied according to the rapacity of the landlord. The aubereaux squeezed everything they could, would go through their muniment rooms desperately looking for another fee to charge, and those who were relatively liberal and had some sympathy with the economic position of the peasantry. Well, above the peasants, there were the bourgeoisie. This group owned as much land as the nobility and had far more liquid capital. They had far more money. The nobility always tended to be land rich and cash poor, but the bourgeoisie had money in the bank. And this too was an extremely variegated class. The skilled artisans in the towns who earned good, respectable wages. Above them, the professional men, especially lawyers, always useful in a litigious age. And at the very top were the grande bourgeoisie, the bankers, the international merchants, and the richest of them all, the tax farmers. Tax farming is not unlike payday loans and cash advances, where the crown would put out tenders for the collection of taxes in a particular province, and then a group of entrepreneurs would purchase the right to collect those taxes, and the profit would be the spread between what they actually collected and what they paid up front to the crown. It gave the crown money up front, which it always needed, and it also meant it didn't have to actually collect the money itself. These grand bourgeois families could be as wealthy as the richest nobles. They had far more money, they were sophisticated, they were learned, they were educated, and they represented to some extent the best of this enlightened world of extraordinarily sophisticated individuals. The bourgeoisie, then more than any group in society, were responsive to the ideas of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, and in fact was the class from which almost all of them came. And also they resented the Ancien Regime the most because they saw it most closely. Although they didn't suffer as much as the peasants, they had this sense of fairness, and with their education and their acuity, they realized that there was something fundamentally wrong in French society. In a world where the nobility was free from taxation, where the king on a whim could grant a monopoly to a courtier and undo businessmen who had been trying for years to start a new business. They resented the centralized restrictions on trade that aggravated the economic situation of those that were trying to compete with much freer societies like the English or the Dutch. And also there was a fundamental disconnect. The bourgeoisie in particular, and again, this was reflected so much in the ideas and the critique of the enlightened writers whom this class produced, felt it was simply unjust and incorrect that the bourgeoisie did not enjoy the social and the political power commensurate with their wealth and their ability, as well as their service to France. The resentment of every class, regardless whether a peasant or whether members of the wealthy bourgeoisie, was directed against the central government. That is, of course, the king. This is the downside of centralized absolutism. If everything's going right, as in the first years of Louis XIV, you become Louis le Grand and everyone thinks you're wonderful. But if things go badly, it's your fault, because everything ultimately returns to you. Royal officials were responsible to no one but the king. The political system led back to Versailles. And there was no effective mechanism for voicing frustration or dissent. There was no safety valve in France at all. And indeed, there was no elected parliament, as in England, where those representatives could debate problems and offer solutions and at least get it out of their systems. In fact, the Estates General, the French equivalent of Parliament, hadn't been summoned for 175 years. Not since 1614, the time of Richelieu, had the Estates General met. All of this opprobrium leading back to Versailles, of course, was directed against the person who was the top, the apex of this pyramid. And it was King Louis XVI, who came to the throne in 1774. Louis had the best of intentions. He had actually read Rousseau. He had read Emile and realized that Rousseau had an interesting idea that everyone should have a manual trade, and became a locksmith, and a very good one. In fact, the greatest pleasure he had was fixing the locks in the Palace of Versailles. He wasn't very smart, but he essentially was quite good. He had another disadvantage. He was extremely weak of will. He just couldn't stick with anything. And when faced with any kind of pressure, he always yielded. And on top of that, he was hampered by a meddlesome and irresponsible queen, Marie Antoinette. Although there have been attempts to rehabilitate Marie Antoinette, I think the evidence is quite clear. Even if she never said, "Let them eat cake," she certainly thought it on a number of occasions. The problems facing France were of the most fundamental kind. They were desperate, and in fact, the entire kingdom was facing insolvency. It was approaching bankruptcy. And the simple reason was not enough money was being collected to balance the books. All of this had resulted from the cost of war, beginning with the wars of glory of Louis XIV. But these wars, and in fact those during the reign of Louis XV, could to some extent be managed through ever more borrowing and through the usual kinds of fiscal legerdemain. But the final attempt to humiliate the English, which succeeded admirably, was support for the American revolutionists. Between 1777 and 1781, the French poured so much money into support for the American Revolution that French finances were strained beyond its ability to raise taxes or to address the issue. By 1789, the debt was 3 times the amount of what it had been in 1774, when Louis XVI came to the throne. In 1789, half the budget went to paying the interest on the national debt. Every year, the deficit was added to the total. And France was rapidly approaching the position where no one would lend it money. Everyone was anticipating a default, so no one was willing to lend money except at exorbitant rates of interest. Something had to be done. Louis, as I said, meant well, and he began by appointing a finance minister of genius, in fact, a philosophe, the representative of the Enlightenment, Anne Robert Turgot, who was a contributor to the Encyclopedia on Economic Matters. And Turgot was a genius. He managed the deficit as creatively as possible, largely by imposing restraint on the court, for which really read the Queen. But Turgot came to the conclusion that all politicians ultimately reach, regardless what they tell their constituents. And that is, you cannot meet this kind of fiscal imbalance through restraint. You have to raise taxes. And in France, that meant one thing. It meant an essential program of radical fiscal reform that would require taxation of the property of the nobility. The court aristocracy, that is, those powerful nobles, those great aristocrats, those noblesse de l'épée around the queen and the king, were furious. They had no intention of paying taxes. They were too rich, too powerful to pay taxes. Who did they think they were? But it didn't take much for these aristocrats to work on the person of the queen, who hated Turgot anyway because he interfered with her mindless, conspicuous consumption. And she convinced her husband, the king, to have Turgot fired. The king agreed. Again, he caved. But in a moment of insight, the last interview between Turgot and Louis XVI, Turgot said, "Your Majesty, I leave with sorrow, but I remind you that such weakness brought Charles of England to the scaffold." In 1786, another brilliant Minister of Finance was appointed, Charles de Calonne. Calonne revived Turgot's policies, and he argued too that there was no solution to this problem unless the privileged classes were taxed. Otherwise, France would have to declare bankruptcy. And in 1787, he summoned the Assembly of Notables. Now, this is a curious French practice where the two estates of the nobility and the clergy were summoned without the third estate. And because they were talking about taxing the privileged estates, the Assembly of Notables came, hoping against hope that maybe they would agree freely to taxation in order to save their nation. Of course, they refused. They absolutely refused to be taxed, thinking, well, if a country goes bankrupt, it's not my fault. Louis XVI, by then, had, even for a dull normal, knew how desperate the situation had become. He dissolved the Assembly of Notables, he fired Calonne, and then, absolute monarch as he was, he promulgated a tax on all Frenchmen of all estates. Well, he may have been absolute, but the nobility and the clergy refused to recognize this. They directed a rebuff precisely to this policy of the king. They said, we're not going to do this. They used their positions in the Parlement to say that this is tyranny and unjust because the king cannot engage in such a novel policy without the approval of the Estates General. Only the Estates General could consent to a policy that was so against French tradition and practice. Once more, Louis caved. He agreed to call the Estates, hoping the problem would go away, and they were to meet the next year, 1789, the first meeting of the Estates General in 175 years. Because so much time had passed, the rules of procedure were either archaic, inappropriate, or altogether forgotten. Nevertheless, the work of the Enlightenment had made some changes and had altered the perspective of all Frenchmen to some degree. The Third Estate was recognized as playing a much greater role in the kingdom, and so the Third Estate would be granted twice the number of representatives as the First and Second. So 600 representatives of the Third Estate would come to the estates, with 300 from the First and 300 from the Second. But this was nothing but window dressing, because the crown, the nobility, and the clergy had intended that voting should be by estate rather than by individual vote. What that means is that for anything to become law, it would have to pass two of the three estates. And the First and Second Estate, as we've already seen, were dominated by recalcitrant nobles who refused to compromise on their privileges. So the belief was everything would remain the same, they would all go home, and there would be no difference. But when the delegates arrived in Paris, things didn't go as anybody planned. Revolutions are never orderly things, and what's more, revolutions always begin before they're actually visible. The circumstances, moreover, had added to the drama. The previous winter of 1788-89 had been terrible, brutal. Bad weather, poor harvests, high unemployment, high inflation. The poor were extremely hard-pressed. Moreover, the articulate bourgeois lawyers elected the representatives of the Third Estate had all read Montesquieu, they had all read Diderot and the writers of the Enlightenment. They all were intent on fundamental reform in a rationalist manner. They prepared their cahiers, their notebooks, their lists of grievances and policies, and taken together, these would have turned France into a constitutional monarchy, a fundamental reform that would have altered the French nation in a way that reflected, to some extent, the dream that Montesquieu had in De l'Esprit des Lois. But in order to achieve this, the estates would have to vote by head rather than by estate. So it was clear that there were enough liberal nobles and enough liberal clerics, together with the double representation from the Third Estate, the change could happen, provided that voting was by head rather than by class. The Estates General met in May of 1789, and on the 22nd of June, the first accident happened. Again, revolutions tend to be driven by accidents rather than by intent. The doors of the meeting hall where the Third Estate was to meet were accidentally left locked. This, of course, was immediately interpreted as an attempt to dissolve the assembly, so they met in a covered tennis court. And there, where they were joined by some liberal nobles and liberal clerics, swore an oath that they would not accept dissolution until France had a constitution. The celebrated tennis court oath changed the nature of the Estates General into what really amounts to a revolutionary body, challenging the authority of the crown itself. Louis XVI did what he did so well and what he did before. He caved, he completely gave in, and he ordered the nobles and the clergy to join the Third Estate, thereby creating not the medieval Estates General, but a National Assembly, given the responsibility of writing a constitution for France. Absolutism had come to an end. Up to this point, the revolution was led by, driven by, the ideas of liberal nobles, the ideas of the bourgeoisie, of the ideas of those who were willing to make changes according to the principles that had been discussed for almost a century by the philosophes. These sophisticated, educated, enlightened individuals believed then that they could apply their reason to the problem and reach a conclusion that would benefit everyone and that the principle of utility would operate. But again, you cannot expect revolutions to be reasonable or rational, because no longer was the revolution to be driven by the educated and enlightened lawyers and liberal nobles, but rather it was increasingly being influenced by the power of that group so frightening to Montesquieu, the mob. On the 14th of July, 1789, the Paris mob, fed by the untrue rumor that the king planned to dissolve the assembly by using the army, stormed the Bastille, that medieval fortress prison in the center of Paris. It was essentially empty, but they killed its governor anyway. And they then realized their power. The National Assembly at Versailles continued its work and, in fact, at this time was also disestablishing the privileges of the nobility. But disestablishing the privileges of the nobility at Versailles by reasonable, rational debate didn't stop the peasants in the countryside from burning their manor houses in order to destroy the documents that they believed were the instruments of their repression. This so-called Great Fear also introduced the rural mob into the revolution. The Great Fear in the countryside, the action of the Paris mob in the Bastille, was beginning to shift the balance in the revolution away from reasonable, rational debate, the kind that Diderot dreamed of as the instrument for the recovery and the reconstruction of France. Nevertheless, that's not to say that this debate did not continue. On the 26th of August, the National Assembly began to write the Constitution. And its preamble, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, was to define its fundamental principles. It sounded like a philosophic text because it contained statements like, men are born free and remain free and equal in rights. Political associations are created to preserve the natural rights of man, which are liberty, property, security, resistance to oppression. All sovereignty resides in the nation. Law is the expression of the general will. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press were to be protected. These ideas, then, were those that had really animated the Enlightenment. These were the ideas of Enlightenment political theory. And moreover, this was a moving document. This is a document that still stirs the heart and is found in most French schoolrooms because it is, in fact, a statement of the fundamental element of humanity in a collective political environment. But again, the making of speeches and the creation of documents was not enough. These idealistic principles couldn't really address what was happening beneath the surface. On the 5th of October 1789, a huge mob of women marched from Paris to protest the price of bread and broke into the Palace of Versailles. They interrupted the proceedings of the National Assembly. They abused the person of the Queen, and indeed the mob took the royal family to Paris as virtual prisoners, never to return to Versailles. No French ruler would again rule from that great palace of Louis XIV. The National Assembly followed soon after, setting up their national government in Paris, an indication again, a reflection of the influence and the importance of the Paris mob. In 3 months, the Ancien Regime had crumbled. What had begun as a liberal reform of the kingdom fell prey to the violence and intimidation of the mob. No longer was this a revolution in order to change France into an enlightened state as imagined by those thinkers of the Enlightenment. Rather, in fact, it was increasingly becoming prey to forces over which those enlightened leaders had little control. This was, in fact, the beginning of the next stage of the revolution, one that was far less noble than the beginning.